Good morning or good afternoon, depending on your time zone. Thank you for joining NAILBA's Diversity and Inclusion panel. I'd like to take a moment to introduce our esteemed panel. First, Cindy Nodorft, Inclusion and Diversity Leader from Transamerica. Next, Cecilia Stanton. She's the Chief Diversity and Inclusion Officer for Allianz Life Insurance Company of North America. And finally, Ronald Reeves, Chief Diversity Officer for AIG. We wanted to thank you all for your time. Looking forward to this session, as I'm sure everyone else is as well. I'd like to start off with Cindy Nodorft with a question around the pandemic and the pivot to remote working and the impact that had on inclusion and diversity priorities for you and for your organization.
Well, thank you, Hector. That's such a great question because obviously it's impacted all of us so much. And when we were immediately sent home, at least at Transamerica, we were in March. My gut reaction was, oh my gosh, we're going to have to change everything. We're going to have to, hold back on events. This is going to be such a big change to our workforce. And about 24 hours in, I made the decision that was absolutely the wrong thing to do because we had an even greater need to stay connected. And our inclusion and diversity efforts really helped with that. What we did is we moved our ERG roundtable meetings that used to be a monthly meeting. We moved those to weekly so that our leaders could get together and talk about how could they collaborate. And one of our employee resource groups focuses on family. And as we all know, families were so impacted, by COVID. And it was a great way to share a lot of best practices. And one of the other things that became very apparent is that the things that we were hosting, that our employee resource groups were hosting, used to be very locational. We had location chapters, things were done in person. And with everyone going remote, suddenly everything was available to all, right? So we actually had greater participation and people joining events that they probably would not have done otherwise. One of our employee resource groups focuses on technology, and they hosted a virtual graduation ceremony for our graduating seniors. So these were high school seniors, college seniors, and we had one of our senior leaders do the graduation speech. I can't even remember what you call those, which is kind of funny, but we thought that was really cool. And then each of the graduates was on camera, with their parents, and we had some pictures that they could share. So, it was a way to really commemorate those graduations. I've seen our executive sponsors become more visible. I've seen people use Microsoft Teams more, in terms of collaborating. And we also rolled out some unconscious bias e-learning that we had been planning to do anyway virtually. So this was, it made that decision for that virtual training even more, impactful. So those are a few of the things that we did to pivot.
Thank you, Cindy. Same question, Ronald Reeves, related to the pivot to remote working and the impact on diversity and equity efforts in your organization.
Thank you, Hector. I would add on to what Cindy said. Our employee resource groups have responded very well to this virtual environment. And what we have loved is they have continued the conversations around race, around diversity, around equity and inclusion. And because we have 145 ERGs in 40 different countries, because we're all at home, we're able to join events that sometimes we would not have been able to attend. The other thing that has just been very apparent to me is that because we are all typically looking at each other like today on one screen, diversity, equity, inclusion, belonging has a spotlight on it. I am hearing leaders saying, I'm realizing how male my team is, how I have several onlys on my team. And so where we've been challenging our leaders is, how do you continue to be an inclusive leader in this environment? Who's talking in your meetings? Who's not talking in your meetings? And so we've also become aware of our words, our facial expressions, our non-verbals. And so we may not have liked what led us to this particular environment, but I'm finding that it is making us connect more. And so we're encouraging leaders to do virtual coffees, do virtual happy hours. And I'm challenging them around, who do you know on your team better than others? And what is making that the case? And what can we do to change that even in this environment?
Great. Thank you very much for that. Same question, shifting over to Cecilia Adams. Cecilia, your thoughts around the same subject?
Yeah, it's great hearing my colleagues from other organizations. And I think I want to lead with that because in times of crisis, it's interesting, how we can lean on each other across industry, across level, across all different ways to try to learn from each other and try to, figure out how to get through this personally and professionally. So, I do, think back and think like, wow, we really did a lot of sharing with the community, what we were going through, and also a lot of listening to other organizations like Children's Hospital. We're not in healthcare, but it was an interesting point of view to listen to how their organization was being impacted through this whole period. I think everybody would probably echo, the movement to remote environment, and having the right technology in place. But the interesting thing for Allianz Life is, for a long time, we were predominantly a work on-site organization. And that was part of our culture. We did lots of things on campus all the time. We had a big auditorium, just beautiful campus facilities. Only about 10% of our workforce worked from home at that time. And, the thinking back then was probably like, we couldn't ever, be a predominantly work from home company. And yet within days, we were able to move people into their homes where they could be safe and give them the access and functionality to be able to serve clients and customers. I was amazed at, how everyone really pulled through together as a team to make that happen. And as a result, we're thinking in new ways about everything, right? We're questioning, do we have to do this that way or that way? Things that we've had as traditional ways of looking at things. How do we bring this lens now to our business to really, remain innovative?
Thank you for that. And I appreciate all the answers to that question. I think we can all learn a lot from that. Speaking of sort of the change that was brought about by 2020, companies, people have thought of unique ways to make differences. What has your company done in support of racial justice? And in your view, what can individuals do? And I'd like to start, Ronald, with you if we can.
So post George Floyd, we empowered our managers to really reach out in particular to their Black colleagues, their colleagues from mixed race backgrounds, and in particular also our Latinx and Hispanic populations, because at AIG, those are our most underrepresented groups when it comes to ethnicity. And we even gave them a guideline, because a lot of our leaders were, how do I have this conversation? We don't talk about race in the workplace. We don't even talk about race in my home. And in some countries, they're just like, this is a topic that is taboo. And so we created a framework for them around having a courageous conversation, because we said it's going to take courage for you to initiate it. And it's going to take courage for those individuals to begin to open up and share some of their experiences that they have never shared in the workplace. And so it was simply, with all that's going on, Hector, how are you doing? And we asked them to probe. Ronald is probably going to say, great. I couldn't be, if I was any better, I couldn't stand it. Our typical greetings that we use in the workplace. I said, I want you to probe beyond that. Ronald, how are you really feeling? And what they heard from me, I'm tired, I'm exhausted, I'm frustrated, even as the chief diversity officer of this organization. And then we gave them a series of questions. And we avoided why, because that meant people were going to become defensive. But it is, what do you need, Hector? What are you hoping for going forward? how can I be a better ally to you? And we asked them to take notes and go into the conversations really ready to listen, because a lot of them give me my script, give me my talking points. And I said, I recommend that you go in really ready to listen. And when you're listening, you're really focused and you're trying to take away at least one or two items that I can do to change my particular behaviors. Now, in terms of individuals, we and our ERGs really led this. We like, you don't have to be a people manager to have a courageous conversation. For some folks on their teams, they're like, I don't feel included by the person who typically sits next to me in the cubicle. And so we encourage them to have one-on-one conversations with their peers as well. And my only advice is come into it with curiosity, lean into the discomfort that you might feel. And then I ask questions there. I observed X. What is making this conversation uncomfortable for you? And it allows us to peel the onion. And what I heard a lot, Ronald, I've never had this conversation with another individual. And I was pleasantly surprised, thinking our employees are like, how dare the CDO ask us to have these conversations? But people said they wanted them to continue and they wanted to have deeper conversations once they were started.
Excellent. Thank you, Ronald. Appreciate that. Cecilia, same question for you related to racial justice. What can companies do? What can individuals do? What have you all done?
Well, we've always had a commitment to our local community, and we were able to give $1 million to local organizations who were working towards dealing with systemic issues of racism. We also made a commitment to accelerate our work in identifying systemic barriers within our organization when it comes to representation at leadership levels, identifying high potential leadership, and the attraction of individuals from different racial backgrounds. And so that, I think that was we were really glad to do that. But I think the other thing, there was a couple other things that really stood out. And you were talking about, Ron, the conversations. I mean, those were so powerful because, to your point, people weren't having these discussions across the country. And, a lot of people didn't even know the history of some of the things that led up to and really were brought up as a result of the murder of George Floyd. So there was a lot of discussion and people moving into places of not being comfortable. I got lots of questions about, how do I talk to my kids? And, my kid's 25. I'm trying to figure it out too. Like, how do I talk to my adult child about, what this means for us in this world? So that was really interesting. But the other thing, the last thing I want to share that I really am proud of is that the leadership team, the executive leadership team, really partnered closely with me as the Chief Diversity Officer to think through what our response would be. And, a couple things were standout with this ELG. Number one, they really wanted to communicate about this. So they talked with their employees directly, which modeled that behavior. We also wrote a direct response to the community, which we put out publicly and shared that out. And we also listened. We listened to what our employees wanted. And we also had specific listening sessions for our people of color to express the challenges and the grieving that they were doing. It was a really tough time for all of us. And, I think we've got lots more work to do. We've just scratched the surface. I think one of the last things that collectively we can all be thinking about is how do we decrease the disparities that happen within the financial services industry and the lack of representation of people of color and women in different levels of financial industry. So that'd be my contribution.
Well said. And thank you, Cecilia. Cindy, shifting over to you on the same topic.
Thank you. Just to add on what Ron and Cecilia said, it's no longer okay to be quiet on this subject. And we were a very quiet company. Our CEO really doesn't speak out about anything. We're not very public in that way. And we did he did make a statement, which was amazing. I was so glad to see that. So that was really a first for us, a public statement, and that all went out on our social media. Our foundation also donated $100,000 to the Equal Justice Initiative and matched employee donations, which was amazing. We made available similar to what the others have said, for our leaders, for everyone really to speak about racism, to educate themselves, how to have these difficult conversations because they are complex and we aren't used to having them. So the great thing is that we are having them. And we didn't have an employee resource group for, our Black employees. They are grassroots and nobody had come forward, which also says something. But we did have some people come forward and say, we want to start one. And so this was the impetus to do that. And we got that done very quickly. They named themselves the Black Professionals for Change. There's some really great leaders. And we chose an executive sponsor who was an influential, white leader, but who could really, influence the change of the company that we want to see happen. And the group hosted an event called Straight Talk on the Black Experience. It was a panel discussion with 3 of our Black employees at different levels. And what was eye-opening was that each one of those individuals had a different experience, right? A different background. I think sometimes people think, well, the experience is the same for everyone, and it really isn't, based on where they were raised, how they were raised. And so that was insightful. But the most insightful thing was that we can have these conversations at work and that they can be really impactful. So I thought that was the best thing that I saw happen out of all of the tragedy that's occurred.
Thank you, Cindy. Appreciate that. And one thing she mentioned was the power of leadership. She talked about her CEO and the comments that they made and the impact of that. Cecilia, related to leadership, how important is it for leaders to show up as allies, and how do you recommend that they do that effectively?
Oh, it's incredibly important. Our workforce is very diverse, right? And it's going to continue to become more diverse. And people don't want the cookie cutter approach anymore, right? They want the customized conversations, if you will, right? They want to be felt. They want to feel like they're valued for their individual contributions and strengths and things like that. You really can't really appreciate value and then leverage talent from many different diverse backgrounds unless you really understand what are the barriers might there be, what are some of the biases that exist? How might I challenge myself to maybe overcome some of the learnings that I've had growing up that maybe are not sufficient any longer or don't make sense any longer? The other thing I wanted to add to that is, in the idea of allyship, we think about it as showing up for someone else, but true allies actually grow more from the experience. So, I also want leaders to realize that it's also about you. It's about you challenging yourself to be brave enough to bring people to the table that might know more than you or might have a different perspective. I tell my team all the time, question me. I want the critiques. And they're like, sure. And they had to experience it a few times where, somebody would be bold enough and challenge me. And I'd be like, all right. And, we'd talk it out and people would witness and say, all right, well, nothing bad happened here. I think maybe we can trust and have that more of that dialogue. Managers need to get comfortable in that. And it takes time. We have to meet people where they're at because, we don't just learn this overnight. So I think for any leader who wants to remain successful in their career, this is one thing that they've really got to start to address.
Thank you for that. That was awesome. Cindy, shifting to you related to leadership showing up as allies, your thoughts around that? Yeah,
I think Cecilia said some really important things. And, our leaders do need to be allies. And I think that doesn't happen a lot of times because there's a fear that they're going to say the wrong thing, they're going to make a mistake. And I think, we all tend to judge. And so what I've really tried to instill in our leaders is, we're going to give each other some grace. We're all working through this together. And I don't have all the answers. I really rely a lot on my network and others to really help me. So it's, meeting people even like today on this panel, these are, we can all learn from each other. So I'm learning as much, from the panelists today as they may be learning from me. But I think that fear of making a mistake is what's keeping people from being allies or keeping leaders sometimes from speaking up. And so, I just encourage, being a good listener, being an active listener and not making assumptions. I heard a good example recently about, really related to women and caregiving and how, everything that we've gone through has created a lot more pressure on women, and maybe managers will want to pull back, don't give maybe the woman on the team the bigger projects or, those high impact things. And that's absolutely the wrong thing to do. Ask them, what do you need? Instead of making assumptions or thinking, oh, I'm gonna do this to make their life easier, because then that could really stall out their career as well and make them less visible. So I think just, listening, asking questions are the best way to be a really good ally.
Great points. Ronald, your thoughts in wrapping up on this subject?
So at AIG post George Floyd, the first communication that our president and CEO sent out stated that we're going to stand as allies, in particular with our Black colleagues and colleagues from mixed race families. And I did get a lot of questions. Our leaders are like, what does that really mean? And we articulated some behaviors that we definitely wanted to see. And one is that we want you to become an ally to other underrepresented and marginalized groups in the workplace. And so an ally is a helper. And for our people managers and leaders, at least at AIG, you're in a unique position. We ask you to inspire your teams. We ask you to focus your teams. We ask you to develop your teams. And so what we point our leaders to is in each of those areas, you are helping your team to grow their careers and to progress. And then when we took a deeper dive, we shared with them, the allies listen. You are really trying, and I said, and you've been doing that already. When you've been leaning in and having these courageous conversations, you've been listening to deepen your understanding about other underrepresented or marginalized groups. And then I said, a lot of you are in a position where you could amplify your voice and speak for those individuals when they don't have a seat or they don't have a voice at that table. And then the last thing is actions. A lot of people say that, I am an ally, but I've been challenging our employees. I've been saying, what proof or evidence do you have that that individual is truly an ally? And when people say, well, what's the first thing I could do? I say one would be education. And our ERGs cover 13 different dimensions of diversity. And so the challenge that I put out to AIG employees, which of those 13 dimensions do you know the least about? And we encourage our ERGs to, one of the things that we ask them to do is do education and awareness around their dimension of diversity. I said, you have a built-in tool. If you don't want to go out and read, the Women and Allies can help you. The disabilities and allies can help you. Our LGBTQ plus and allies can help you. And that's the other thing that we've been very intentional about. All of our ERGs have allies attached to their names, because we're like, it's not just good enough, in my opinion, for the Black professionals to get together, because we need allies as well on this particular journey. And so we're encouraging people, which ERGs are you allies to and for?
Excellent points. Thank you all for those great answers. I want to shift to a another subject, and I'll start, Cindy, with you again. Regarding just a definition, the layman's definition of diversity, it centers around race and around gender. How should we be expanding that in our business and frankly, in our personal lives?
Well, it's so much more than race and gender, but I know that is where people's minds typically go. I like to think of it in terms of, inclusion and diversity. It's definitely a journey, not a destination. And we have an exercise that the I&D team at Transamerica offers, and it's called the Go-To Network Discovery Exercise. And it helps to really expand that thinking because we use the iceberg model. You probably are all familiar with that, the iceberg model, what's above the surface of the water is, that visible diversity, what you can see, and what's below is all those aspects of diversity that you can't see, that aren't so visible. So we talk about that, and then we ask individuals to write down the names of, up to about 8 people who are in their personal network. And then they go across a spectrum of differences, things like sexual orientation, family status, gender, race, and how are those people different from them. But it has introvert, extrovert, on that different scale. And one of the things that people typically say after that exercise is, wow, I didn't think about all of those different ways that, people are different from me, even different career, right? People tend to have maybe that network in people that are all in the same, career, the same company that they work in. So it does open eyes, and they get a score. It's not necessarily a bad score or a good score, but that's something to work towards. So we found that to work really well. We also, in our education series, the e-learning that was developed, we started with what are the definitions? Like, how does our company define diversity, and how does our company define inclusion? And I think it's really important to lay that groundwork so that people understand what that really means.
Thank you, Cindy. Cecilia, would love to think through your answers around the same question related to the definition, how we should span beyond race and gender when thinking about diversity.
Yes, well, I definitely echo my colleagues, right? I love the term that Cindy used, spectrum of difference, right? The 18 dimensions of diversity that Ron referred to, it's endless, right? There's so many ways in which we're different. Personality was brought up, and my wife and I ran a business for a long time, and I'm an extrovert, so I love getting out there and meeting with people, and she's an introvert. She likes to take time and process what she's thinking about. So she always says I'm a microwave and she's a crock pot. And it's so true, because I would always come up with these great ideas, and I'm like, yeah, I want to do this, that, and the third. And then I'm looking at her, I'm like, you're not listening to me again. And she's like, I'm processing. And I'm like, oh, that's right. And I've known her for years. We grew up together, but I still need a reminder. We still need to remind ourselves that we are different in the way that we perceive the world. And when we recognize that and value it, then we're unstoppable as a team, because now we don't have a blind spot in places where if we did it individually, we would. And that's the same for the business, right? So everyone is diverse. Everyone, has different perspectives and experiences that are valuable. I think when you can get people to understand that, then they become open to the conversation of where we need to focus, like gender and race. It makes sense then, right? Because you then acknowledge that, a white male is still diverse, right? That he still has generational differences. Maybe grew up with a single mom, maybe was middle class, and all those things are important perspectives. But we have a lot of work to do in terms of really looking at historical injustices and making sure that we're not repeating them in the future.
Great. I've never heard crockpot used as an analogy, but love it. Love it. Ronald, same question to you related to broadening our definition beyond race and gender for the word diversity and the concept of diversity.
Hector, I think that is really important. I mean, in today's times, our employers are saying, well, we only focus on race, we only focus on gender, and then, some are adding, we only focus on age. But there are over 40 different dimensions of diversity. I think of geographic diversity. I'm located in Los Angeles and our headquarters is in New York. And I tell them, I think differently. I've had different experiences from those of you that perhaps have been raised and lived in different parts of the East Coast. When we think of cognitive diversity in terms of how we think and approach situations. So I challenge leaders. People may not look like you that are seated around your table, but do they think like you? And that's what, we're challenging people. How do you add some people around your table that perhaps don't even look like you? And even more important, they don't think like you. And for me, diversity is about embracing our differences, our uniqueness. It still troubles me, going back to the exercise that Cindy talks about, that a lot of employees do not bring their whole selves to work. There are things about me that make me unique and make me different, and I mask and I cover. And so at AIG, we're on a journey that it's really, how do we not just have diversity, equity, and inclusion, but we have belonging, meaning that I can come here and I don't have to mask. Or if I mask, I'm choosing to, but I don't have to. And in so many ways, when I look out on our workforces, they're like, Ronald, they're not ready for me to share those other parts of my dimension of diversity and the things that make me unique.
Wow, powerful stuff, guys. Thank you for that. And I'd like to shift over to Cecilia on a question related to the inclusion part of diversity and inclusion. Tell us about what that means to you, the inclusion part of diversity and inclusion.
Yeah, well, it's definitely, it rings true personally, and really what drove my passion and interest in diversity when I started my career. Both my parents are from Honduras, so I'm a first generation American. I came out at the age of 16, so identified as a lesbian. I was a part of all these different groups, and all these groups never got together. So for me, it was like, how do I really find the place where I fit in, where I feel included and valued, even though it might be a little bit different than, how someone else maybe sees the world. And I think it was just my personal journey of discovering that for myself, that I realized I can create these spaces for other people. And so, I think that's what I come to work with every day, this idea of how do I create more access and opportunities and open doors for people who don't even realize there's a door there. There are so many people that looked out for me and spotted talent in me when I didn't see it myself. I think I have to pay that back in many ways. And inclusion is I think where we all need to go and where we're going to get a lot of value out of diversity. Diversity just happens. It's a matter of fact, right? But it doesn't give you anything unless you're working towards inclusion.
Love it. Love it. Ronald, shifting to you related to that same thing. What is inclusion, the inclusion part of diversity and inclusion, and what does it mean to you and to your organization?
I mean, I would build on what Cecilia was saying, that diversity is a fact. So I identify as African American. I am a male. I mean, those are facts. Inclusion, on the other hand, requires action. So that means I need to exhibit some behaviors and I need to take some actions if I want others to feel included. I'm challenging our organization. Yes, we want to increase our representation numbers for underrepresented groups. But if we bring this talent in and we don't work on the inclusion piece, I need to feel like I'm included to do my best work. And that's going to take actions on the part of not only our leaders, but our employees. How do I make others feel welcome? The other part of that, when I think about the inclusion piece, it starts with an I. And so that's what I have a finger pointing back at me saying, what am I doing to make people feel included at AIG, and it's an action. And then I'm also glad that Cecilia touched upon on that if we want inclusion, we're going to have to get to some of the systematic barriers that are in the way. And that's why a lot of us are now talking about equity, because what we realize, we may have diversity, we may have inclusion, but until we start to address those systematic barriers, we will not have equity.
Powerful point. Appreciate that, Ronald. Cindy, same question to you.
I heard this when I first started doing this work, and it's really kind of helped me to stay focused. And it's diversity is being invited to the party, and inclusion is being asked to dance. Mm-hmm. You know, it is that action, you know, that Ron mentioned. And so, you know, there are things that companies really need to do. And I can tell you that I've, you know, didn't always really understand how diversity and inclusion are not, you know, mutually exclusive. And you can bring in people who are different. And if they don't feel like they are included or that they fit or that they can be themselves, they are going to leave. You know, they're not going to stay. So all of your efforts are for naught. So absolutely have to have an inclusive culture even before you can have a diverse culture or a diverse workforce. Yeah. I think our employee resource groups have been such a powerful, you know, source for inclusion because they're grassroots, because they give people so much autonomy, you know, to lead and to be involved. And I've seen people who wanted to join the company because they saw people like them who were, you know, at events attracting talent, right? So we don't just take our recruiters, we get our employee resource group members involved in a lot of events. In fact, they can recommend where should we show up, you know, where do we need to be to attract talent. Another example that I've heard about recently was, you know, in terms of your employee assistance program and counselors, that they also need to reflect your workforce. And, you know, people want to talk to somebody who can relate to them, right? Who will understand their story. So that's, you know, that's part of inclusion, is making sure that people can see themselves.
Thank you. Last question, and throughout this session, you all have brought up things already. There may be a few that we haven't spoken about, but you've talked about whether it was ERGs or the how-to guidelines to have courageous conversations. But what other programs and systems can companies put in place to ensure that you are cultivating all employees, any and all employees and their backgrounds? And Ronald, I'll start with you if there's things that you perhaps hadn't mentioned throughout the session.
I mean, I don't mind sharing things that we're exploring inside of AIG, because we are thinking through, if we want a different result, we're going to have to do some different things. You know, people say we can fix it, and I'm asking, how are we going to do it, and what are we going to do new and different? So some of the things that we're thinking through are diverse sourcing strategies, both internally and externally. And I want to go back to our previous question: beyond age, beyond race, beyond gender, how are we going to source for this particular talent? The other one that we're thinking through are diverse or blended interview slates. How are we going to ensure that the talent that we are seeking is even making it through to that particular final interview? And research has shown if you have one woman, she's probably not going to get hired. If you have two women, there's probably a stronger likelihood. And so what we're realizing, we're going to have to get more people in our funnel to get them through to that interview phase. The other one that's probably not meeting as much traction as I would love is even doing blind resume reviews, because that takes away some of the conscious and unconscious bias. So it would take our names off of it, anything that identified our race off of it. And some companies have shown that more underrepresented groups are getting through their funnel when they take that blind approach, because now you're looking at their skill sets, and you've defined a criteria that you're going to compare them to and take out the subjectivity. And then the last thing, we're going to take a look at our processes, our practices, our protocols, because what are the barriers that are getting in the way? And where we're starting is with talent acquisition. How do we acquire talent, and how do we move our talent through the pipeline? And what are some of the barriers that are getting in the way for, in particular, underrepresented and marginalized groups?
Thank you, Ronald. Appreciate that. Cindy, same question to you. What other programs that perhaps we haven't talked about can companies put in place?
Yeah, we're doing some of the same things as Ron in terms of talent acquisition and really ramping up our efforts. We're calling it anonymous resumes, but similar, to blind resumes, because I think that's a pretty effective thing that we can try. So we're piloting some of those things. We also benchmark our best practices. And I know a lot of companies do this, and I really look at what are our peer companies doing. But Working Mothers has a really good 100 best companies to work for. Diversity best practices, the Human Rights Campaign, Corporate Equality Index, and getting a perfect score. And you can't get on those lists without having inclusive policies and programs, because they really vet the applications quite well, and they take a lot of time to complete. So I think that benchmarking is super important. We also measure our progress. We measure ERG participation, and does that, are we seeing an uptick in that? We measure our donations through our foundation to organizations that serve diverse populations. We measure percent of women in senior leadership positions, being like a director position and above. And we have some goals that we set for that. And we also survey our employees and ask them, does the company value diversity? Do you feel that you can be your authentic self? And we're seeing some increases, right, in the positive results from that. So I see that as a really positive thing to do. And we hold everyone accountable for inclusion and diversity, not just leaders.
Perfect. Thank you very much. Cecilia, last but not least, your thoughts around systems and processes we could put in place or that your company has done.
Yes, and I'll echo, my colleagues' great best practices. And if you see me jotting down, I'm just, learning from all of you as well. But what I'll add to that is sponsorship. We're exploring sponsorship and building a program. So we're very new at this. But the idea of it is that, we think about mentorship. A lot of the challenge around mentorship has been, you mentor people that are most like you, right? Because you see something in them that reminds you of yourself. And so if you don't have people in different leadership roles that look like you, they may not even recognize that talent in a different package, right? And so it's important that we're kind of breaking that down. We wanted to take that to the sponsorship level because we're really looking at how we increase gender and ethnic diversity at the very top levels of leadership. And, it's a huge undertaking. It's a lot of different strategies that you have to put in place, but we want to make sure that we're committed to our employees internally and that we're identifying their talented individuals early on and that we're sponsoring them in a meaningful way so that, one of our senior leaders becomes their sponsor and then basically takes them under their wing and is a partner in helping them shape their future career at Allianz Life. I'm really excited about the potential success. I know, there'll be also some barriers. I'd love to share, our learnings with my colleagues here today. But yeah, I'm really excited about that. And I'd love to see that spread some more.
Well, thank you, Cecilia. And I wanted to thank NAILBA, and I wanted to thank all of you. I'm honored and humbled to have been on the same panel as you all to talk about a very important subject, not just because of 2020, but because of what it can have as an impact, not just to our industry, but to mankind. So appreciate all of your time and certainly appreciate being part of the panel with you all. Thank you.